the first part, which we'll talk about today, is really just setting the scene, I guess, with defining what I mean when I say conduct problems and how that is different to other sorts of problems that kids come into classrooms with. Um, and then we'll talk about what are some of the things that make kids more vulnerable to developing disruptive behavior problems, because as we know, not all kids have them. And then the second thing we'll talk about today is a bit of theory, a bit of a framework that we're going to use then to talk about the third thing in our next workshops, which is actual practical strategies um, for managing um, some of these difficulties that pop up with these types of kids. So I guess the point is here to say that there is a spectrum of behaviours when we think about sort of the umbrella term of conduct problems. We have sort of our more low intensity behaviours, so things like inattention, so being assigned a piece of work and then daydreaming, or being off task in their behaviour, so talking to somebody next to them, getting a bit distracted. So those low intensity things that don't necessarily impact on the people around them or are super disruptive to the flow, but still offer some sort of degree of being disruptive. And then we sort of move up to things like interrupting and being non-compliant. So with your instructions, with the school rules, um, those sort of the big feelings. So the emotional dysregulation, the temper tantrums, whether that could be something quite small like whining, all the way up to sort of throw myself on the floor, hide under furniture, that sort of thing. And then the big guys as well. So being physically aggressive, verbally aggressive, or being destructive, like we said, with throwing the example here, throwing the iPad, but throwing furniture as well, which has happened quite a few of the kids who I've worked with. So these are sort of just some examples, and we could throw so many more at the board, and a lot would stick. But this is just to say that a lot of kids will show bits and pieces here and there, particularly of these lower and even middle intensity behaviors, and you have strategies to deal with them. It's the kids who are showing these all of these behaviors, but particularly the high intensity ones that are doing it more often than not, that I think become the kids who struggle, and who are the kids who might benefit from extra support, like a PCIT model. So that's sort of just throwing things against the wall. A lot of things are sticking there. And so what I'm going to pivot now to is talking a little bit more about the clinical diagnoses. So I'm a clinical psychologist, so I can and I will diagnose kids with particular types of things. Diagnoses are useful to a point. So this is the reason why I include it, because diagnoses are being thrown sort of into the mix. And they're useful because they communicate a lot of information about a particular kid quite quickly. So they can tell you what you might expect or the types of things that a kid might be struggling with. I think it's good for you to know what they actually mean and how they're different. But we're also going to talk about some of their limitations as well. So I guess when we're talking about the classics, one you've already mentioned is oppositional defiant disorder, ODD. And so when you have a kid comes in with this label, what you would be expecting to see is this pattern of behavior where they're showing emotional dysregulation. So anger and irritability, sort of the temper tantrums, if you want to call them that, the breakdowns, the meltdowns, whatever it is. So that's sort of those big anger, irritability, hostility emotions. Then you're also expecting to see a pattern of oppositionality or defiance. So where they're argumentative with authority figures, for example, their parents, where they break rules, where they might annoy other people on purpose, so deliberately undermining sort of the flow of things or the rules or the expectations. And you might also see evidence of some vindictive behaviors, so spiteful behaviors or getting revenge back on people who they see have sort of transgressed against them. So that's sort of oppositional defiant disorder. You get these three things of anger and irritability, argumentative and defiance, and then spitefulness. Less common in the age of the kids who we work with, so the K to 2, but is still possible to hear about is conduct disorder. So this one's a little bit more severe, and what you would expect to see here is this pattern of behaviour where the child or the student breaks the rules, or violates other people's rights. So you might see things like being destructive with things. So the extreme one being, fire setting, for example, being physically aggressive or verbally aggressive, being cruel to animals is listed in this one here, and then sort of breaking the rules. So, running away from home, going to the shops without permission, those sorts of things. So, like I said, more rare in our 5, 6, or 7-year olds, but I've certainly seen kids who have met sort of enough of the boxes to tick for conduct disorder. You also hear about, more often than not, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And I put this one in here because if you have a kid who is coming in with oppositional defiant disorder, more often than not, they're also going to have ADHD thrown in there. But they are separate things. If you have ADHD, what you're really looking at are two sort of main clusters or groups of difficulties. On the one hand, you have the attention ones, so struggling to pay attention, to sustain attention, to switch attention. Um, this type of kid will get distracted easily, is forgetful, loses things. And then on the other hand, you have the more impulsive or hyperactive symptoms. So the calling out, the interrupting, the sort of fidgeting, that idea of being driven by a motor, talking a lot, that sort of stuff. And you can have a kid who's the primarily congestive, so less of the hyperactive. You can have a kid who's primarily hyperactive and less of the inattentive, or you can have a kid who's sort of high on both types. And I put this in here because I think ADHD is the one that is sort of the most thrown around, and even more so and increasingly amongst adults, thrown around as being particularly common and sort of the driver of a lot of difficult behaviours. But actually, at no point listed in sort of the behaviours that define ADHD is that is any aggression, is any defiance or oppositionality, is any sort of sense of these kids deliberately annoying or undermining the people around them. So just having ADHD doesn't necessarily mean that you're also going to have all of the other disruptive behaviors thrown in the mix. But what it does mean is that those things are probably more likely to happen. Because if you struggle to control your impulses, you know a rule, you struggle to control the urge not to break it, because you're more impulsive, sort of temperamentally, it's going to mean that you're more likely perhaps to retaliate against somebody if you perceive that they've hurt you, to do something that you're not meant to do, even though you know the rules and you want to obey the rules. So it makes things like ODD and conduct disorder a bit more likely to happen, makes you more vulnerable. So I wanted to throw those out there for you just to give sort of a little bit of, I don't know, context for some of the labels that you might be hearing pretty frequently. And I guess to then start a conversation about the limitations of what these diagnoses mean. Because despite these being the classic disruptive behavior disorder labels, you also see disruptive behavior really commonly in lots of other, diagnoses that we see come through the door. Autism spectrum disorder, separation anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. In autism, you will often see the big, like the anger and the irritability and the meltdowns and the defiance around transitions from preferred to non-preferred activities. If you interrupt a routine or a specific interest, with separation anxiety, you will see similar sorts of refusal behaviors or emotional dysregulation at the point of separation from a caregiver at the door. So you're seeing these big behaviors that we would classify as conduct problems or disruptive behaviors, even in disorders that we wouldn't place into that category. So they're not super specific, and it's the reason why we're seeing the behavior, which I think won't come as a surprise to you all, that I think is more interesting, but critically more helpful for us figuring out how we might go about responding to it or managing it. And then the other problem or the other limitation with diagnoses is that even if you have two children who both come in with oppositional defiant disorder, even comorbid ADHD, so two kids who have both these diagnoses, they can look very different. And the reasons why they are doing the things they're doing that classify them as having that label can also really differ from one child to the next. So it's just having the label, like I said, it gives a lot of information quite quickly, but it doesn't necessarily tell you anything specific about that individual child, how they got to that point and what's keeping them stuck there. And then critically for us, the adults who were around them, the best ways to go about responding to them or managing the difficulties that they're bringing to the table, right? So I guess the point here is for you to sort of know those things and know the difference between them, but also be aware of the limitations. And for us then to, I guess, recognize that these kids are a real mixed bag and our way of responding to them will be similarly a mixed bag then. Um, but to give a little bit more clarification around that, I guess it's been the job of researchers like me, so this is something that I'm really interested in, of taking this mixed bag and trying to make sense of it a little bit more, to give us a little bit more guidance of what we might, if we have a kid come in, we notice particular characteristics, to give us a better sense of what strategy is more or less likely to work with this kid who has this particular set of characteristics. So what we do to do that is take these kids and go, okay, if we divide these kids into subgroups based on particular characteristics, can we get subgroups of kids who are more alike one another than they are to kids within another subgroup? So sort of sorting our citruses from our leafy greens if we have a mixed bag of salads, for example. And so one of the ways that we have found is a really, it just has lots of usefulness, like practical usefulness, of dividing sort of the bigger bag into more subgroups is by taking the kids. So we've got the circle, the Venn diagram here. We have all of our disruptive behaviors, or some of them at least, that we've spoken about them. And so you have a kid who's showing these things. But there are also some kids that, on top of these things, are showing what we will call limited pro-social emotions. And so that's just like an annoying, like psychologist speak way of talking about the conscience or moral emotions. So if you have a kid who is limited in their pro-social emotions, what you're likely to see, the characteristics, are a lack of guilt. So they've done something wrong, they've broken a rule, they've hurt somebody. And unlike most kids, I would say, who you can see feel bad, even if they don't say it or even if they struggle to apologize, you can see that they feel bad or they feel remorseful about having done the thing. This is the type of kid where evidence of that remorse or guilt isn't super obvious. Similarly, you may be picking up on callousness in the way that they relate to other people, or a lack of empathy. So they really struggle to understand the emotions of other people or to put themselves in the shoes of somebody else and experience the types of emotions that that person is experiencing. There's this real sense of uncaringness or a lack of concern about how well they do in important activities. So you would see it perhaps in classroom tasks, homework tasks, sport, even for these carnivals, super carnivals, Friday soccer, all of that sort of thing. They may like to win, but putting in the effort, and if they don't do well and they get feedback on that, there's just this like, I don't care. It really doesn't bother me. It doesn't upset me. I don't care. And then the last thing I've listed here is this sense of having shallow feelings. So this is a little bit harder to judge in our kids who are younger, because to some degree, all kids recognize that emotional displays or having being sad when something happens leads to certain outcomes. So there's a sense to which all kids sort of use their emotions to sort of create a situation that benefits them. But for these kids, this is sort of what happens more often than not. So there's a real lack of sort of genuine upwellings of feelings other than anger, where they might switch on and off their emotions and look really sad to get out of something. But as soon as that is taken away, there's no sort of emotional hangover and they're right back to normal. So it's sort of like an odd emotional sort of a landscape there. So this is not most kids, and certainly certainly not most kids, and it's not even most kids who have these disruptive behavior problems. So what I'm going to do is sort of do a bit of a compare and contrast of what we might see if we have a kid who belongs more to the citruses, be the kids who belong more to the leafy greens. So if you have sort of just this classic display of contact problems, what you might expect to see is a lot of reactive behaviors. So lashing out in retaliation is very sort of hot, sort of disruptive behavior that's reactive and retaliatory and sort of 0 to 100, right? But what we tend to see with these kids is that after the fact, particularly once things have calmed down, and perhaps they've sort of worked with someone to talk about what the impact of their behavior was, you do see evidence of being distressed by the effects of their behaviors on others. And across the board, there's sort of these high levels of emotional reactivity, not just in sort of the anger, irritability sort of domain, but being highly excitable and the happiness sort of peaking, and then potentially you go, oh, it's so much. So I guess what it's like these very emotional, highly reactive, um, deep feelings, these sort of kids. On the flip side, we have kids who have these limited prosocial emotions where you do see this sort of hot reactionary anger or aggression, but you also see what we might refer to as proactive. So this is sort of more cold aggression or behavior where it's almost goal directed. So I'm going to threaten you because you're using a pencil that I want and I really want that pencil. So I'm going to be aggressive towards you to get the pencil. That's not in reaction to anything. That's not retaliating. That's sort of goal-directed aggression, right? So that's a bit more proactive. Um, and like I said, this lack of concern about how the behavior affects other people, unless it impinges on the person themselves, or unless it interrupts what they want to do, or the flow of their behavior. And there's this real underreactivity of emotions, except for anger, which we see quite sort of strongly. And it's interesting because we see this even if we put these kids into sort of neurological scanners, that the places in the brain, so the amygdala or the limbic system, that tend to show activity when we're experiencing an emotion. We see that for the kids, the lemons, the citruses, we get an over response in these sections, and the kids who have these limited prosocial emotions are seeing an under response in these brain regions. So it's even on a neurological level, we're seeing it at the same time as we're seeing it on a behavioral level. So in the classroom then, relevant to you, what might these two groups of kids look like? I don't want the impression to be that the kids who have the contact problems but intact pro-social emotions are easy breezy and really like lovely and fine, because that's not the case. We're still seeing really high levels of behaviors with these kids, of the temper tantrums, the refusal, behavior, the irritability, arguing, hiding, stealing, breaking things, and physical and verbal aggression. We're still seeing that. So it's not as if these kids are necessarily any easier or less intense. But what we're seeing on the other side is all of that, and perhaps as well, things like being bullies to kids who they perceive as weaker, either physically or socially. This sort of real refusal to apologize and engage in any reparative work unless it's forced or unless it is something that they use to sort of keep the day going. And it's like, yeah, sorry. There's this real lack of genuineness or sincerity about it. And then what you also tend to see, because I'm super aware, like teachers are so good at having almost debriefs or conversations with kids where they really try and get the kids to perspective take and understand what they've done, the effect that that's had on other people or on the classroom. And those conversations can often feel as if they're not quite connecting, or the kid is, even if the kid is saying the right things, there's not the sort of emotional connection with you or with that conversation or with the person who they've hurt. Even if maybe intellectually they seem to be getting it, emotionally something is lacking there. So yeah, they really struggle to do that perspective taking. Or if it's an older kid, if they can, this perspective taking doesn't often come with it that emotional sort of heft that we might see with another kid. And like I said, this lack of care about getting into trouble or not doing well, I would be horrified if my name was put on the board, but these kids sort of, there's no bother. It doesn't, there's no shame response. There's no embarrassment. There's no feeling bad. It's just like, I don't care. And this sort of lying or manipulative sort of interpersonal style as well, a cunningness that we often see. So I put that up there to sort of give us a little bit of a sense of the differences. And I guess what we're going to do now, what we just did then was take a snapshot of what they look like in real time, these two kids. And what we'll do now is go sort of forward. And this is me telling you why you should care about this difference. And it's not just sort of me and the things that I'm interested in. There's actual reasons why this way of dividing kids is something that we've thought a lot about and has got sort of a lot of attention. And those reasons are because of when we project forward in time, if we time travel into the future, these kids look different from the more typical kids in terms of their outcomes. And then if we time travel back into the past, the types of things that make them vulnerable are also different. And that's what I'm going to spend the most time on talking about, because if we can understand why something develops, what makes kids vulnerable, what it is about them or their environment that increases their risk of having these problems, we can then identify some of those risk factors to act on that we can sort of target in our management strategies, right? Or in our interventions or our day-to-day management of them. So this is why I'm going to spend sort of more time on the development. But just quickly, if we project forward, the reason why we care about this particular group of kids with limited pro-social emotions is because they have really bad outcomes. Both individually, like they themselves aren't great in terms of their outcomes. They also have a real impact on like the world around them. So this one particular study, which I thought was really interesting, compared kids who have pre-adolescents, so sort of into primary school age kids, who have conduct problems, to those who have conduct problems and these limited pro-social emotions. And when they looked at them sort of years into the future, 4 years, 5 years into the future, the kids who had the limited pro-social emotions were more violent, they were more often violent, and their violence was more severe. They engaged in more sort of versatile crimes as adolescents. So not only were they doing property damage stuff, so graffiti or fire setting, they were also being aggressive towards people. So they were also doing interpersonal crimes. Similarly, with what I sort of spoke about before in terms of the reactive and proactive, we see that continue on. So they're doing more premeditated stuff as well as being reactive and using retaliatory aggression. More violent sexual offending. So these are kids who are more likely, and it's not an A to B, please don't get me wrong, if you have a kid who you're thinking of, this is not, biology isn't destiny, this is not the guarantee, but these are just kids that are more likely to or have higher risk of going on to be sexual offenders. And when they have victims, those victims tend to have more severe injuries. So like I said, outcomes for themselves, yes, but also for the world. In terms of themselves, they're more likely to use substances and have sort of quite severe mental health problems. So we care because these are the kids who are going to go on, even during adolescence, let alone then going to adulthood, to have the most problems and to cause the most problems if we're thinking more about like a society point of view. But we see this even when we sort of look at little kids, right? So this same pattern that if you have little kids, so this is one particular study that combined lots of studies together and found that on average, the kids who under 5, so that we're talking like preschoolers now, before they come and see you, we can see evidence of these limited pro-social emotions. And when we do see these limited pro-social emotions, the conduct problems, the destructive behavior that they have tend to be more severe. So even before the kids have entered school, you're seeing evidence of this, and you're seeing that the problems that they have are more severe, more versatile. So it's a really sort of robust association, I guess we would say. And at school, this is really interesting because for a long time, the focus in the research was all about these kids. It tended to focus on these kids when they were sort of involved with the justice system, so looking at their criminal outcomes, and that's when they were like adolescents, or it focused on the parenting and the family sort of setting, right? But more and more, what we're recognizing is that when you have students in both in preschool, so early childcare, in primary school, and in high school, who have destructive behavior problems in combination with these limited pro-social emotions, you're seeing effects in school settings. So the classroom behavior, the destructive behavior in the classroom is much more severe for these types of kids. These kids are more frequently disciplined at school, so they receive more discipline. You tend to see more bullying, both direct and indirect bullying. They tend to be less connected to their peers, less well liked by their peers, less connected to the school, so that bondedness, that sense of connection to where I go every day is a lot lower. And critically, from a teacher point of view, these are the kids who teachers report to us as having more conflict with and less closeness with. Actually, I'm looking at this using some of the data from these workshops that we're doing together from the other schools. I put this together, and so even for us in our context, I'm seeing this association where if a teacher nominates a child who they say has these limited pro-social emotions, you're telling us that you feel less, in particular, you feel less close to these children. They're harder to have an emotional, warm, affectionate relationship, student-teacher relationship with. And then on top of that, these are the kids who have the worst academic achievement, engagement, and are more likely to drop out at school. So even though this science is newer, fresher, there are really some really robust findings. So this is why we care, because yes, they go on to have really bad outcomes. They start sort of worse as well, but these are the kids who in the classroom are making your lives particularly difficult, is what the science is telling us. This is why we care about it, right? And this is what I'm hoping is like the fresh stuff for you, because I know that you've done PLs in the past and you've probably done so much of your own independent learning around these kids. But this is something, talking to teachers over the years, that I have found has been less well known or less commonly spoken about. There's been less awareness of it, of this subgroup. As a spoiler alert, I guess, is these kids don't respond in typical ways to our standard behavior management. So even though they're the ones who may have the biggest impact and the ones who are the most disruptive, they're also the ones who tend to respond the less well to our typical ways of managing behavior problems.